20 years ago tomorrow was a dark day in America's history, indeed, I think in world history, September 11th, 2001. I think all of us will remember where we were when we heard what happened in New York City, in Washington, D.C. I think all of us will remember, at least most of us in America, the anger that we felt, and in a lot of cases, the helplessness and the fear. Reflecting on it 20 years after the fact, it's a day that's really changed the country, changed the world, changed our policies in so many different areas of life, and just how people think about government, what they want from their government, and especially how America sees itself in the world. So at the Salem Center, we're going to have a couple of events, this panel and a episode of our podcast, Free Lunch, reflecting on the impact of 9/11 over the past 20 years. And in this panel in particular, we're going to talk about America's foreign policy response. It's a interesting time, a sad time to be doing that. We're pulling out of Afghanistan now after 20 years in Afghanistan. I think no one, whatever their view of what should or could have happened there and what the right policies are, I think no one's happy with what's going on in the country now, except possibly the Taliban leaders and their supporters. So it's an interesting time to be reflecting on American foreign policy and how we responded to this attack. We've assembled three panelists to discuss it with us, and we're going to hear from each of them. Peter Brookes of the Heritage Foundation, Elan Journo of the Ayn Rand Institute, and Justin Logan of Cato. And I'm going to begin by asking each of them to comment just on their overview of like the essence of how did America respond, what have been the results, what's the big picture, what's the forest of which all the news items we may have heard and all the particular op-eds and all the particular incidences and opinions are the trees. And after we've heard from each of our panelists, we'll kind of convene for a discussion among the three of them. I may ask some questions or they'll pose questions to one another, and we'll take questions from you in the audience via the Zoom Q&A feature for those of you who are watching in Zoom, or if you want to put a question in YouTube, it'll be relayed to me. I can see the Zoom Q&A, but not the YouTube, but we have people outside who are monitoring it and relaying the information. Peter should be online in a few minutes. He's just having some connection issues. So let's start with Elan. Elan, what's your big picture?
Well, thanks for having me on this panel, Greg. I think it is an important topic. It's a grim topic, but an important one for us to spend time reflecting on. I would say that people have given a lot of attention to what's happened in Afghanistan. And in the spirit of your question of what is the big picture, what is the forest, I think the shameful situation we see in Afghanistan, the fiasco of the withdrawal, the many aspects of it that could be commented on, I think it's a microcosm of the bigger story, which is that America in the 20 years since 9/11 has really failed to respond to the threat that we faced that day on 9/11 and to fundamentally fail to understand what we're facing. And I think that is the story here, is that it's a failure to really understand and confront the nature of the threat we faced. Now, a lot of people at the time, and I'm sure this will come up in our conversation today, thought the problem was existential, that we're facing an existential threat. I don't think that was true at the time in 2001. But as a consequence of the way we approached our response in foreign policy in the last 20 years, we haven't made the problem an existential one yet, but it's certainly worse than it needs to be, and it's certainly not gone away. So instead of having defeated the threat or eliminated it or reduced it to something negligible the way we would want to as a result of a response, we've actually made it worse. We've made it stronger. And I think the epitome of this is the fact that, as many people have commented, it's worse than ironic that Afghanistan now is back in the hands of the very same people, same movement that put it in such dire straits and was home to Al-Qaeda back in 2001. It's grim, and it puts the whole loss of life, the trillions of dollars invested, it shows that I think that all of that has been a colossal disaster. I mean, it's a foreign policy disaster. So I just want to make two broad points to illustrate my perspective. One is the diagnosis, and one is about the consequences. So I think the diagnosis I offer, and I think this is, hopefully it's going to contrast with some of the other speakers we have today, is that I think the essential issue is that the United States foreign policy, and by this I include both the four administrations we've had since 9/11 and the establishment that speaks about and comments about foreign policy, including the media, which went along for many of these decisions. The essential issue is we've evaded, or we refuse to recognize what is the enemy, what is the Islamist movement, and specifically that it is a movement and that it's ideas driven, that it's an ideological phenomenon. And I think of it as an ideological movement rooted in Islam, but distinguishable from Islam. And I think it's important to make that distinction. We failed to do that. I think the many ways we can illustrate that with the George W. Bush administration going out of its way to try to distance the enemy from Islam, trying to present Islam as a religion that was hijacked. Now, there's many arguments to be had about the relationship between this movement and Islam, but I think that it's important to recognize that it is rooted in these same ideas, and that's central to understanding both how it arose, how it became prominent, and what its goals are. So I regard that as failure number one. And the consequence of this is the Bush administration shutting its eyes to this problem meant that key aspects of what you would want to do were not done. So part of what you would want to do is to understand, okay, this is what they're after. They're after not simply terrorizing us, which is a means, but a certain goal, which is to subjugate people under this totalitarian vision of their interpretation of Islam, wherever they can do it. And they want to inflict harm on other countries because they regard us as infidels, trespassing on holy lands, and so forth. But it's a narrative saturated with religious thinking and religious ideas and values. And you would have to recognize as well, which I think was a story in the 20 years before 9/11, that this movement was growing in popularity. It was a cultural force in the Middle East. And it had state sponsorship in various relationships. Not all of them were like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. That was one kind of state relationship. And those kinds of relationship would trace back to regimes that we didn't do anything about and that we should have confronted, namely Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, I think is very central and salient here. And so there's discussions to have about the wars we did pursue in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think in effect, they were not the priorities, not the things we should have been doing. So we didn't pursue this phenomenon as a movement. We didn't pursue its actual prominent state sponsors. And one of the consequences of this is that we didn't take the actions needed to really eliminate this threat. And if you understand, one consequence of understanding it as an ideological phenomenon is to know that the way to stop this threat from becoming worse and from eliminating it is to teach the people who pursue this view that their cause is lost, that their goal is unachievable, and that in effect you need to demoralize them and to demoralize their leadership and all those who stand in a position that claim to be standard bearers for this idea, and particularly the movement sponsors and inspirations, the regimes that I think are central to this phenomenon. We didn't do that. I think there was no real attention. In fact, Saudi Arabia was and remains widely seen as an ally to the United States, despite many ways in which it is harmful to us and was contributing to this movement. Pakistan, there was a really sordid story about how the Bush administration tried to turn Pakistan into an ally. I don't think that went anywhere close to what it was supposed to do. It was a case of Pakistan taking American aid and not really doing what it promised to do in combating Islamists. There's many sordid aspects to that story. But I think the consequence here is that we didn't pursue the kind of goal that would lead the enemy or this movement to feel like its goal is unachievable. Instead, what actually happened by 2014, when Iraq was obviously a disaster, Afghanistan was a no-win war that was created by US policy. By 2014, what we see is the emergence of a splinter group from Al-Qaeda known as Islamic State. They take over a massive tract of territory. They create a totalitarian regime. And if you want an indicator of how low we had gotten to by 2014 and where we were, it's that this movement was galvanizing people. People were flocking to live and fight for the Islamic State by the tens of thousands, including people, a minority, but a significant minority, from countries where there is freedom, there is economic opportunity, from countries like the United Kingdom and France and Belgium and Australia. That is a significant cultural marker that 13 years after 9/11, this movement is able to attract so many followers. Whatever you think of them, whatever you think of the motivation, it's a fact that once Islamic State declared a caliphate, it became a clarion call for so many people to come and fight for it. So to me, that's a marker of how this movement was far from demoralized or defeated, but in fact, galvanized. I want to make one final point in tracing out some consequences. I'm sure there's many more we can talk about, but one is that a lot of these failures were compounding failures. They built upon each other, mistake upon mistake. So I have very dim views about the Bush administration's approach to Iraq and the surge and all the ways in which we define success down. And then the Obama administration's approach, which I think compounded the fails. But we can get to that in the conversation. But I want to make one point that I think is an unseen problem or an underappreciated problem. And this is, to borrow from Frederick Bastiat, this whole phenomenon, the whole idea that there are things and costs that we don't appreciate because we don't see them, they're not obvious. And that is the cost to us who live in the West, not from the continual threat of terrorist attacks, which I can't put a number on, but it's still a thing that might happen. And we can't know when that happens. And not even the fact that Al-Qaeda is still around or that the Taliban are back in power. All those things are significant. We need to address those and recognize them. But we live in a time now, 20 years after 9/11, there is a climate, particularly in Europe, but also in North America, where it's become a risk to one's life and reputation to speak about Islam as having critically, and particularly to talk about it and ridicule it, which I think should be something that we should be able to do about any religion or any set of ideas. And here I'm talking about the legacy of the Danish cartoons crisis, which erupted in 2005, 2006. And we can talk about what that was about. That was a test of how bad is the self-censorship in Europe. And it turns out it's really bad. And it turns out that if you publish cartoons in a newspaper in Denmark, that can lead to a global eruption of violence and boycotts and real loss of life. And then fast forwarding to 2015, to the massacre of the journalists at Charlie Hebdo in Paris. I think that's another marker in a trend. There are many other markers, but this is a significant marker where they were put to death by self-defined jihadists for the so-called crime of blaspheming or insulting the religion of Islam. Now, this, you might say, what does this have to do with 9/11? These people are not terrorists like the ones who flew planes into buildings. No, they're not. But they are pursuing the same goals, the same ends, even if their means are different. And their goal, you can see, is directly related, which is they want people to bow to their religious view, that they think Islam should govern not just where they have territory they control, but everywhere. And the logic of that is, if you think this is the one true faith, why not? Why should it not prevail everywhere? And so the idea of imposing these Islamic views about blasphemy within the West, that is of a piece with the whole conception of what the Islamic totalitarian movement is about, which is imposing their religiously based ideology on people everywhere to the extent they can. So to me, this is a really important unseen cost, which is our freedom of speech has been diminished to the point where there is such a thing as the jihadist veto, and people are unwilling to talk about it. I mean, this is before the so-called cancel culture erupted here on different issues, but it's literally a case that if you have said things in Europe and in parts of America, you face death threats. You have to live in police protection. And to me, this is a way in which whatever else happens on the battlefield, whatever happens in Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya, any other of these places, this is a sign that the Islamist movement has gained some purchase towards its goals. It's diminished our freedom, and it's a significant freedom, the freedom of speech, such that you have Yale University Press is afraid to publish a scholarly book about the Danish cartoons crisis with the cartoons in it because of the risk of harm to the people involved. And that is a really sad marker that we're now 20 years into an effort to respond to this threat. And we're not only seeing the Taliban resume their control of Afghanistan, we're also seeing parts of the free world succumbing to the fear that some fighters in league with this whole conception of what this crazy vision is, crazy is not the right word for it, imposing their views at the threat of a gun or a knife, so that you cannot criticize, you cannot speak about this. This is a taboo topic, where if you want to do a documentary about this, you have to crowdfund it. And then the people who crowdfund the documentary remove their name from the credit line because they're afraid of reprisals. That's an actual example of what happened. So there is this diminishing freedom of speech that I think is an unseen cost of the disastrous foreign policy 9/11, because when the Danish cartoons crisis erupted, we appeased that. And when Charlie Hebdo attacks happened, nobody spoke out for the principle of freedom of speech. And I regard that as of a piece with evading the nature of the threat we faced in 9/11. So to me, that's the essential. There are significant consequences that have followed from it. And some of them, as I've described, are unseen, and we need to really appreciate them.
Thank you. That was Elan Journo of the Ayn Rand Institute giving his big picture summary of the last 20 years of American foreign policy after 9/11 and its results. Let's turn to Justin Logan now of Cato. Same question.
Great. Thanks very much to you, Greg, for inviting me to participate. Thanks to everyone for being here, and to the Salem Center for including me. I'll open with a sort of idiosyncratic personal note. I worked in this business for over a decade, U.S. national security from 2004 to 2015, burned out, opened a wine bar, sold it, came back. And now I have this sort of weird benefit of being able to look back on this era like a grandparent who hasn't seen its grandchild since before COVID. It's so much bigger. It has glasses now. Your hair is longer. So I have the benefit of some distance, or what I hope is the benefit of some distance. I want to make three main points about this era, and any effort to sort of synopsize 20 years of U.S. foreign policy is going to miss some important things. So I look forward to filling in the gaps in the discussion that ensues. The first main point that I want to make is that the broad arc of policies that we summarize as the global war on terrorism were disastrous and unnecessary for U.S. national security, and for the countries in which we started the wars. The second point that I want to make is that a big reason that happened is that we dramatically overestimated the threat posed to the United States by Islamist fundamentalism or radical Islamism, or whatever the term one cares to use. And if I don't run out of time doing that, I'll conclude with a third point, which is that the global war on terror was very corrosive to Republican Madisonian institutions and what we used to think of as Republican virtue, the sort of a government that we could trust, a government that wouldn't lie to us, et cetera, et cetera. So to begin with, the wars. I think to start, it's important to point out that the government didn't respond to the 9/11 attacks by carefully assessing where they came from, why they came from that place, and what could be done to punish, deter, and just kill the individuals who had perpetrated the attacks. Rather, they seized the moment to do a number of things that they had wanted to do before the attacks. So we have Donald Rumsfeld's handwritten notes from the afternoon of September 11th, where he writes in shorthand, "Hard to get good case. Need to move swiftly. Near-term target needs. Go massive. Sweep it all up. Things related and not." Donald Rumsfeld was first recorded as considering Iraq a target on September the 11th itself, his deputy Paul Wolfowitz on September the 15th, and President Bush asked Secretary Rumsfeld for war plans on November 21st, 2001. So they really had a preset view of the things that they wanted to do, and those just slot in to the opening that was created by the September 11th attacks. Another point that ties to Afghanistan that's important to point out is that both Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz were very wary of committing deeply to war in Afghanistan for the simple fact of the shortage of aim points. There just wasn't a lot to shoot at in Afghanistan. Both individuals recognized that this was an extremely underdeveloped country. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure. And as a consequence, there wasn't a lot that could be done in terms of the global war on terrorism in Afghanistan. Now, this was used as a reason to do Iraq, right? Because there wasn't enough to do in Afghanistan. But it really didn't seem to permeate their thinking about the limits of what could be produced in Afghanistan. The mission in Afghanistan sort of limped along as the political centerpiece of the global war on terrorism, the war in Iraq, began. As we now know, thanks to the Brown University project on the costs of war, the wars killed about 1 million people, give or take. They cost about $8 trillion, although the meter is still running. And of course, among that 1 million people is thousands of Americans. And really, I think the number would be better represented as tens of thousands of Americans. One thing that's important to point out is that the casualties, that is to say, the killed in action numbers for Afghanistan and Iraq are much, much lower than they were in Vietnam. And this is something for obvious reasons to be thankful for. But there are two costs to this. The reason that the casualty numbers are so much lower is that the United States has simply gotten much better at field medicine. It can save lives on the battlefield to a degree that it couldn't during the Vietnam War. Again, this is a very important plus to the way we do war today, as opposed to the way we did war 50 years ago. But there are two consequences of this. Number one is that while the killed in action numbers are depressed, the injuries, the casualties that are not killed in action, include a lot of people whose quality of life has been severely diminished. So you have triple and quadruple amputees who would have died in Vietnam, but were recorded as injuries in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you have a number of people who would have been killed in action, who are now just sort of coded as wounded. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these improvements in field medicine are very expensive. So to the extent that we save lives for those who are injured on the battlefield, the pecuniary cost of the wars goes up in significant numbers. So I think that's the sort of nutshell, thumbnail sketch summation of the wars themselves. And I've noticed a recurring argument among people who are enthusiasts for the global war on terrorism, who say, "Look, there was no follow-on attack to September the 11th, so that has to be counted in the positive column for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." And this is an interesting argument to me. My colleague John Mueller has done a comprehensive assessment of all the anti-American terrorist attacks and terrorist attack attempts that have been recorded against the United States September the 11th. He has a 1,086-page compendium detailing every one of these attacks, and none of them resembles in any form or fashion anything remotely of the scale of the September 11th attacks. And I would point out that the government that would have interdicted such an attempt has very powerful incentives to show its work on what it did and to congratulate itself. And the fact that we have not heard self-congratulation and we have not seen the work done suggests to us that there was no 9/11 Part 2 in the offing. That moves to the second point, which is that we overstated the threat to the United States posed by international terrorism. I mentioned before that I left this business and went into the restaurant business for a few years. And one of the merits or demerits of that, I guess you could say, is that I developed a greater sense for things like profit and loss, things like sales projections, things like investments. And I know that the Salem Center has a lot of econometrically inclined people and people who deal in finance and investment. So I think it's useful to think about our assessments of the risk from terrorism with an eye to that frame of mind. And I would ask the question, I guess, is anybody here still long terrorism? Do we hold the same views about the risk posed to the United States by radical Islamic terrorism, or again, whatever one cares to call it, that we did in the fall and winter of 2001, 2002? I think we probably don't. And I think we probably didn't accurately assess the risks to terror posed to the United States by terrorism in those days for understandable reasons. But with the benefit of 2 decades of hindsight, we can look back and see that our fears of having to duct tape ourselves into our homes as a consequence of a sarin gas attack, the idea that the anthrax attacks that were perpetrated against the Capitol would become a fact of daily life, suggests to me that our risk portfolios need updating, that we indeed overstated the military and security threat posed by radical Islamic terrorism. And I would just pose this problem. I, as a good Irish Catholic, am not a member of Islam, but it is worth noting that almost a quarter of the world's population subscribes to one flavor or the other of the Islamic faith. This is about 2 billion people. If 1/1000th of 1% of them were amenable to terrorism or to the idea that the United States should be attacked for this or that reason, we'd be looking at 20 million people who were inclined to terrorism. And I would suggest that over the course of 20 years, we would have seen a tremendous amount of damage perpetrated by these people. There are millions of Muslims in the United States, and while there have been horrific attacks using firearms, for example, there really hasn't been this sort of targeted, directed, unified effort that characterized the 9/11 attacks. And I think 20 years later, we should be able to say that we may have gotten the overall risk assessment wrong. Excuse me for shaking my camera. In conclusion, I want to just mention the corrosion of Republican virtues and Republican institutions that were caused by the global war on terrorism. I began wanting to make the point about how much lying has permeated the global war on terrorism, and went down a rabbit hole where I found there was just lying upon lying upon lying upon lying. We now know that the government began illegally collecting data on hundreds of millions of Americans' telecommunications, and then lied to Congress when they were caught in the act. James Clapper was asked directly, and I'll quote here, "Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?" This is a perfectly discreet question. It was clear as a bell, and Clapper responded, "No, sir, not wittingly." He got away with it, and we are now treated to Clapper's pronunciations on political developments on MSNBC. Lying to Congress should bear some consequences, I would suggest, in a democratic republic. We know that the CIA tortured people, and when Congress began investigating torture, the CIA began spying on Congress in contravention of the law. But asked about this, John Brennan lied on television about having surveilled congressional inquiries into the torture report. And I would conclude with the Afghanistan mission close in the rearview mirror, that just this month, General Mark Milley, who, of course, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was asked what went wrong with the Afghan mission. He sort of shrugged and said, maybe those forces were not designed appropriately for the type of mission, without pointing out that General Milley had been one of the individuals who was responsible for designing the forces appropriately for the type of mission in which they would find themselves. So I think there's been an overstatement of the threat posed by terrorism, disastrous, expensive wars perpetrated as a consequence of that overstatement, and an utter failure of anyone to take responsibility for the ruin left behind them. And I think this is a tragic chapter in American history that we would do well to turn the page on. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Justin Logan of Cato. I'm saying your names afterwards, like on radio, because this will be sometimes it's a podcast. I might not see your captions. And I want to now turn to Peter Brookes of the Heritage Foundation to give us your overview, the big picture of American foreign policy since 9/11 and its consequences.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm late. I don't actually have a Zoom account. I'm probably the only one, and my 12-year-old, my 11-year-old was able to help me rectify that quickly. Luckily, he was home from school, but most times I haven't had to have it. I just kind of signed in. So I'm making up by coming in late, by leaving early, as I mentioned. Greg, I apologize, but I have to have a couple of appearances this evening, one in the 5 o'clock hour with Fox Business, to talk about 9/11, and they were particularly interested in the fact that I was at the Pentagon on 9/11. It's different from Justin and Elan, I suppose. I don't know that. And I was, although my responsibilities there were for the Asian Pacific region, not the Middle East or Afghanistan, South Asia, it has had a tremendous effect on my thinking. In my opening remarks, I didn't. It appeared as Elan and Justin did to speak a lot about the global war on terror. I had other issues as well. So let me talk a little bit about that. I think I'm reminded as I was thinking about this, and I looked at the question I think a little bit differently than the other two. In an anecdote that involves Dean Acheson, who most people know was Harry Truman's Secretary of State at a very important time in American history. He was dealing with the beginning of the Cold War, the end of World War II, rebuilding of Japan, rebuilding of Germany, the People's Republic of China, the new People's Republic of China at that time. The Soviet Union, the rise of the Soviet Union. And interestingly, I'm not sure the story might be apocryphal, but it's a great story regardless. Acheson was asked by a reporter and said, "Mr. Secretary, how do you define foreign policy?" And he thought about it for a minute and turned to the reporter and he said, "Foreign policy is just one darn thing after another." And I think that says a lot. And I think that the last 20 years has been has been a challenge to deal with uncertainty. There's been a tremendous amount of uncertainty, especially starting with 9/11 and preceding that. I don't think it's just after 9/11, and of course there was the global war on terror. Al Qaeda, as bad as it was, I don't think that anybody. I didn't hear all of Elan's talk, but nobody mentioned ISIS. ISIS was the largest, richest terrorist army ever. We saw an incredible flow of foreign fighters from around the world. I remember lecturing on this at one time, and I'm a little dated now because I've turned a bit away from terrorism and a bit of a globalist in my position. From 90 different countries, we saw foreign fighters move to Iraq and Syria, mostly Syria, where they were setting up a caliphate and were involved in unbelievable atrocities. All of them. I won't go into them. Which was a tremendous threat, not only within Iraq and Syria but beyond. And there are a number of terrorist attacks that took place around the world that were related to them. And if they had not been stopped, I don't know where it would have been. We also made tremendous gains against Al Qaeda. Now, I do have concerns about our policy in Afghanistan. I would not have advocated if the president had asked me, and he didn't. Would not have advocated a full withdrawal. I think that a small force there to help steel the Afghan security forces with intelligence and perhaps air cover would have been important to keep Al Qaeda and ISIS-K, as you know, ISIS Khorasan province. Keep after them. I'm worried about Afghanistan once again becoming a safe haven for transnational terrorism. So I'm concerned about that. But I think there were tremendous challenges, and I think after a number of years that we had some success. And remember the challenge of terrorism was not just something that happened in the Middle East or in Europe or in the United States. It was Southeast Asia. I don't know if people remember Jamal Islamiyah in Indonesia. Al Qaeda, and well, there's still challenges in the Philippines today. There were a number of plots. I mean, in 2006, people forget, or there was, the reason we can't take liquid still on the aircraft is that there was a major plot to take down aircraft flying from the UK to the United States. So there have been significant challenges to everybody, and there are challenges beyond the global war on terror. We can criticize. We can certainly learn lessons along the way, and we should do the best that we can in that way. But there's the other challenges too that have come about. We've seen the advent of great power competition that involves Russia and China. In my opinion, China, would like to replace the United States as a preeminent power in the Pacific, and I think globally. And they're making great efforts to do that. They're becoming increasingly assertive. There's concerns about the South China Sea, which the Chinese consider to be a Chinese lake today, 1 million miles of open ocean that Chinese consider to be sovereign, indisputable. I think I'm quoting here, indisputable Chinese sovereign territory. There are concerns about that when you have $3 trillion worth of trade that goes through it every year. The military buildup. I don't know. I've written a couple articles recently about the Chinese ICBM buildup, the building of undisclosed ICBM silos that could put them as a near peer or peer of the United States in ICBMs. That's significant, especially since China won't involve itself in arms control. Russia, Putin has been a challenge for quite some time. I often remind audiences of what Putin said in 2005. He's been around that long in power, either as president, the once and future president, I sometimes refer to him as. I think he took a spin as vice president and then came back. And I think he was going to be around for a while, assuming his health stays. He said the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, that didn't make my list as the greatest geopolitical tragedy, but it gives you an idea of the insights and the views of people inside the Kremlin, certainly Putin. And he's repeated that since then. I can't tell you exactly where and when, but I have seen it pop up again, that people note that. So Russia is resurgent. There's no question about it. It didn't like the way that the Cold War ended, and it sees the United States as a nemesis, certainly, unfortunately, and NATO as a threat, which I think is incorrect. I don't know if my colleagues mentioned, Iran or North Korea, other major uncertainties that we're dealing with, especially because I see them as rogue states, especially because of their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Obviously, North Korea is a nuclear weapon state. Iran, I believe, it has aspirations to become one. I'm very concerned about what it's doing now, and I think both of them have the opportunities to be large forces for instability in both of their regions. And if you look at where North Korea is and the challenges it would provide if it were to invade or attack South Korea. I mean, look at the economies out there: Japan, Taiwan, China, South Korea. I mean, some of the largest economies in the world, and the effect it would have, the reverberations across the globe if there were conflict there. And of course, North Korea is very quiet about itself. I mean, we're all wondering why Kim Jong-un looks so good these days, lost a few pounds, it appears. Whether he has a health problem or he's taken up jogging, we don't know. But there are big questions about any sort of succession in North Korea and their intentions. It's always a huge challenge for the United States and others. And of course, if there were to be something on the Korean Peninsula, what role would China play? All you have to do is look back to 1950 and the 200,000 Chinese volunteers who crossed the border in support of North Korea after the Incheon invasion, and where things are. In fact, we don't even have a peace treaty; we have an armistice on there. And with Iran, I mean, Iran is a Shia Persian country and a Sunni Sunni Arab neighborhood. It has its grievances with its neighbors. It wants to be my view is the most powerful Muslim state in the Middle East and in the world. Certainly leading the Shia around the world. I have concerns about its efforts in the Middle East, and of course it's nuclear situation. So there are huge challenges, and I think both Republican and Democratic administrations. It's easy to look back. My view is it's easy to look back and armchair quarterback this and criticize people for what they did. But I think just like with the pandemic we're dealing with, I mean, that's another uncertainty, right? There's these wild cards out there. I mean, I think in fairness that people have done the best they could. History will judge them, right? History will judge them and how well they did. But a lot of these problems, these challenges, whether you're talking about we used to call the 4+1, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran plus terrorism, like the pandemic, which is obviously having international repercussions, not only here in the United States, but around the world. I mean, they're talking about, trade. They're talking about supply chains, which I think people at the business school will understand. Blockchain and all these things I don't really understand. But people are talking about it because of COVID. People are, making their best efforts in terms of this. And the one thing I would think, I would ask others to understand is that Makers don't have a lot of time to study these things, and they're often dealing in uncharted waters. And 9/11 is one of those events. The pandemic is certainly one of those events. They make things extremely, extremely difficult. You have to remember that I think one of the other very important things to remember in the Pentagon and when I was in the military is that the enemy gets a vote, or your opposition gets a vote. And that's true in international diplomacy, that's true in economics, that's true in security issues. So despite your desires to influence things in the direction you'd like, it just doesn't always work out that way. So I'm happy to go into any of these other things, and I apologize, I'm going to have to head out in a bit, but thank you very much for the invitation, and I apologize for lack of IT capabilities, but thankfully my 11-year-old was home from school and helped Dad out once again.
Thank you. Yeah, let me pose some questions to you first, and I'll be interested to hear the other panelists do, because I know you have the least time. So if I'm understanding the kind of overall top headline point about foreign policy you want to make is that it's in effect a dangerous and uncertain world in a lot of respects, and we're having to react. Our policymakers are having to react in what time they have to surprising events, and so it's easy to sit in an ivory tower and criticize them, but it's the real world out there is difficult and tricky and complicated, and you're describing a lot of the ways in which it is. Are there any principles you think, though, are especially important for foreign policy, for policymakers to bear in mind, or what would you say are the top one or two principles that they would need to bear in mind to navigate this uncertainty as best as is possible? And do you think they were borne in mind well in the response to 9/11?
That's a challenging question. Can I get back to you on that? Maybe write a research paper or something. That's a good question. That's a very good question. I think one of the things I said is that the enemy gets a vote, or your opposition, whoever your adversary gets a vote on these sort of things. The other thing I try to remind people is that policymaking is not foreign policy. International relations is not engineering. It's not accounting. Like for instance, this house I'm sitting in. If the forces didn't equal zero, this house would be moving in one direction or the other. Okay, it happened to equal zero because it was engineered correctly. That's not true in foreign policy. Okay, 2 + 2 = 5. 2 + 2 = 7. And there are real challenges there. The other thing I would say is that, and I would love to. This is a great question. I would love to give it more thought, and I'm sure that Elan and Justin probably are hopefully scribbling good things down now to educate your audience. But the other thing is that as a former policymaker myself, and like I've been in the think tank world for a long time now, but as a Capitol Hill staffer and as a senior Pentagon official, policy is hard, and implementation is even harder. So anything you do and you put down on paper, this is it's not always easy. You have plans based on your understanding of history and culture and other things. And you try to put those things into motion and they don't always end up. I mean, you had a plan, Greg, you had a plan for today, right? You had a plan for today. And when you look back tonight, before you turn out the light, it won't look anything like you thought it would be. You thought Peter Brookes would be on time and something interesting to say. And you were disappointed. I'm just kidding. I'm having a little fun. Maybe. No. I understand. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. I get up in the morning and I usually if we'd be going to the office, I would leave with our son to take him to school at 7:45 and hopefully be in certain places at certain times. And we know with DC traffic, that's probably not going to happen. Okay.
It's like everybody
you got a plan, but implementing that plan is just hard. Another thing I would say about international relations is it's incredibly difficult to work across cultures, to understand across cultures. I mean, I can't even, my wife says she can't even understand me, and we've been married for 20 years, right? So, I mean, it's somebody she sees every day. Imagine trying to do this across cultures outside of the United States. I mean, look at the politics in the United States, right? So this is tough. The point here is that this is tough stuff. I think a business community, a business school would certainly understand the challenges that you face, dynamics of business, dynamics of international affairs. I think are critically important. So I'll just stop there. I didn't have anything right off the top of my head, but that's what I came up with.
Let me just ask Elan and Justin, do either of you have things you'd particularly like to ask Pete while he's with us?
Elan, do you care to take anything, or?
It would be interesting to hear your 9/11 story, Pete.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll try to be quick about it, but thank you very much. I was at the Pentagon, and I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia Pacific, and I was getting ready to make my first trip overseas. Going to Hawaii to Pacific Command, which is now Indo-Pac, but was Pacific Command at the time, and Japan and Korea. I headed out for the airport. I picked a flight that was through San Francisco and United Airlines on the morning of September 11th. Headed out the door, and I remember it being a beautiful, like we're having in Washington today. Kind of cool, fall-like, sunny. It was just a great day. Got out there, got on the plane, no problems. It was very few people, not like today. The planes are so busy today. Got in there, and we taxied, and I think I fell asleep, quite frankly. Working in the Pentagon can require long hours, and I know I was up late the night before and up early to get to the airport. I drove myself, and I fell asleep, and I woke up, and I realized we hadn't moved in a while, and I was worried about missing my flight onto Hawaii. We didn't move from that spot, and we were actually sent back to the terminal at Dulles. And as I was walking through the airport, Dulles isn't what it used to be. I don't know if you've been through Dulles. Dulles is much fancier now with lots of places, but then it usually had a couple of bars, and they usually weren't open for breakfast. But the televisions had started to come on in some of these places, and I saw that the two planes had hit the Twin Towers in New York. Went back to the baggage area, and my bag popped out. But while I was there, I met some friends and probably some people that that worked in foreign policy that I had known, and they said the Pentagon had been hit. So I grabbed my bag and I headed for the car and couldn't contact anybody at all. But when I got home to my house, one of the messages, other than from a lot of other wonderful people, was from friends wondering about me, was a message to return to the Pentagon. I had been an acting assistant secretary at the time. Our assistant secretary was overseas, and so grabbed a few things and headed up 395, which some people may know is the main corridor up to the Pentagon from Northern Virginia, and it was completely empty, which made it really eerie. And then I could see the smoke at the Pentagon. So I returned to the Pentagon and helped to respond to the policy issues that we were having. But even more interesting, I was angry at the fact that our country had been attacked, my city had been attacked, my place of work had been attacked. But the other interesting part of it is that a few weeks before I took my trip, my assistant came into me and offered me two flights. One was an American Airlines flight from Dulles to Los Angeles, and the other was this United flight from Dulles to San Francisco. The United flight was a little bit later in the morning, not much, about a half hour, I think. But when you work for folks like Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, an extra half hour is a lot of time to yourself. And I was going to be gone for a week or so, and I wanted to be home a little bit longer. The other flight that I decided not to take was the one that flew into the Pentagon. But for the grace of God, go I. And so it had a tremendous impact on me. And though I was not involved necessarily in the response to Afghanistan, I obviously played a supporting role as we used the Pacific significantly. So I'm lucky to be here. So I maybe have a little bit different view than some other people, but I think we all remember where we were on that day 20 years ago. I think a lot about that when these sort of anniversaries come about. So thank you for asking.
Thank you. Let me ask one of the questions that's come up from, we have two so far that came in from users, viewers, sorry. One's addressed to the whole panel. Do members of the panel believe, in their personal opinion, that due to the destabilization of the Middle East caused by the United States, that the United States should accept refugees instead of Europe? So I guess the idea is here, the war on terror created a refugee crisis, or rather our actions in Iraq and Afghanistan did, and do we have responsibility to the refugees for that? Any thoughts from anyone on this?
I guess I disagree with the premise of the question. In terms of the United States being responsible, and I think that the largest refugee flows were actually out of Syria under ISIS. But I may be wrong on that. I will defer to somebody who perhaps has those numbers. Maybe Elan or Justin knows. But obviously the United States has done a tremendous amount in terms of humanitarian response. I think it's part of nature. I think the United States, although I disagreed with the Biden administration's policy and their evacuation withdrawal in Iraq, I can't say enough about the American Armed Forces, diplomats, and NGOs and others who have done tremendous things to reach out to help those in Afghanistan. I think the United States has been doing this, we're one of the, if not the most generous country in the world. But I think, once again, I disagree with the premise of it, but I think the United States and the international community should stand together to address these challenging humanitarian issues that we face regardless. But like I said, the tremendous amount of those refugees, as I recall, into Europe actually came out as a result of ISIS.
I think there are a number of premises behind this question, besides even the one that we caused the refugee crisis questions about how refugees and immigration should be dealt with generally. But does either Elan or Justin, do either of you have anything you want to say to this question?
If I would reframe the question, I would take up some of the premises you're hinting at, and one response general, one response specifically. So the general response I would have is, I think the existing policies and protocols and agreements for refugee resettlement, I think they need to be revisited. I think they're really messed up. I mean, I've studied it a little bit in Europe, and I think it's certainly they made very bad policy decisions in mid-2010s. But I think the general guidelines and understandings about how to define a refugee, who should accommodate them, and so forth, I think that all needs to be rethought. I think it's a mistake to treat them as they're all perfect, and we just need to figure out who takes which people. So that's a general comment. And I think I want to focus the question on Afghanistan in particular, because I think this is a case where it's much more clear-cut than what happened as a result of the Syrian civil war, which I think there are many actors involved, Iran, Russia, and many other groups sort of stirred that up. And I think that complicates the issue, although the US obviously was involved. I think in Afghanistan, you have a clear case of people who risk their lives to assist and help in various ways the US and coalition forces for many years in some cases. And I think there was an understanding, at least, if not formal agreements with some of them, that not only would we help them be safe while they're working with us, us meaning the United States forces, but that there would be a path for them in case something went awry, and that they would have a place of refuge if hostile forces came after them. And I think it's hard to overstate the risks these people took in a society where there's, I think, understandable, but also not understandable hostility to outsiders, coupled with fear of what the Taliban might do if they come back, or other Islamist forces. I think it's a tragedy, a completely avoidable tragedy, that there's so many people who were not able to be processed for special visas to come to the United States to find protection. And I think that is one of the stains of many in the way the United States handled the situation in Afghanistan in this withdrawal process. There's similar kind of considerations that I think you could bring up in the context of Iraq. I know someone, I think Greg, you know him too, who worked with American coalition forces in Iraq, helping to spot and scout al-Qaeda operatives. We don't have to get into his story, but the issue is, I think people like that, they consciously took a risk, and I think it's appropriate for us as a nation to give them a safe place to live if it's not possible for them to reside in their home country. So I think that kind of narrowed question, I think, is fairly straightforward.
Thank you. Let me ask another sort of general question that came up to the panelists in general. Daniel online is asking, do you feel that the situation in the Middle East and the pressure of having control in the area is a result of the geopolitical fight between the US, OPEC, and Russia over control of oil in the last 20 years? So is this all about oil, or was this? And if so, does this continue to be a main pressure point for US foreign policy moving forward? So what was the role of interest in oil in all of the everything that's happened in the Middle East in the last 20 years, and what's changed, if anything?
I'll take a quick stab at that, because I am going to go. Thank you very much for having me. So I think I'm going to kind of leave after this and leave it to Elan and Justin. Illuminate your audience further on these issues. But you could have said that a long time ago, but not anymore with the American energy renaissance. I remember people talking about energy and independence, and there are still questions about policies on this, obviously, and there's energy experts out there smarter than me on it. But whoever would have ever thought that the United States could be energy independent? And we had moved certainly in that direction. There are challenges today, and we all know that the oil market is global. It's not only one country. You're not an island in that sense. And the gas prices we're seeing today have things to do with things like hurricanes and travel, as well as the fact that OPEC and Russia are working together to improve their bottom line. Right, Russia. This is the major export of Russia, and I'm always reminded of John McCain's when he talked about Russia being a country, a gas station masking as a country, and it's very important to the Russian economy. There's no question about that. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily true today. There have been challenges in the past, obviously. OPEC, can have an effect on the American economy, and it has. Going back over the years. So, but I think that the importance of American energy independence is critical to having an independent foreign policy and less pressures on that foreign policy. So, with that, Greg, thank you so much for having me. Nice to see you, Elan and Justin, and hopefully see you soon. Be well.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Yes, so a big takeaway point there is whatever role concerns about oil might have played in the past, it'll be, you might think it'll be transfigured now, or is being transfigured now by America's having more oil domestically. Elan or Justin, any responses to this question from Daniel about the role of oil interests in Middle East policy?
I'd like to offer one thought on that. And I want to go back to a question you raised earlier too, and put it to Justin, but let me first respond to the question about oil. I think that in the context of post 9/11 policy, I don't think it was a prime driver in decision making, but I think it was a distorting factor in some cases. So I don't believe the story that some people were arguing for, that post 9/11, everything was about getting oil from the Middle East, and Iraq was about oil. And I don't think that really meshes with the facts. I mean, I think there were other factors that are more explanatory. So let's put that aside. But I think there was a way in which concerns about the flow of oil from the Middle East, which is a valid consideration, it's clearly a value to be able to trade oil with other countries. I think it became a distortion so that America, to start with, didn't have a coherent conception of its interests in the Middle East. I don't think there's anything like a coherent view. And I think that's true regardless of whether it's someone who's Democratic or Republican sitting in the White House. I think it's a bipartisan problem that there isn't a sort of thoughtful conception of what is in our interests in the Middle East. So the one consequence of that vacuum or that incoherence is that when we approach, how do we deal with a country like Saudi Arabia, which is a big question that occupies or should occupy policymakers. oil becomes a factor, and it becomes a distorting factor, so that instead of thinking about what kind of regime Saudi Arabia is, what its character is morally, how it treats its own people, is it a free country, is it not a free country, to what extent is it a country that we could have rational relations with, and what does that look like? Is it hostile? Is it friendly? Is it somewhere in between? All kinds of questions that one has to consider and weigh objectively. Those are pushed aside and they're outweighed by this view that whatever else we do, we can't alienate the Saudis because we need their oil. And I think that it's a symptom of amoral thinking. It's really pushing aside questions of, well, do we really want to be buying oil from these people given the way they operate? This is a country that it's 2 steps away from ISIS, really. I mean, it's not to exaggerate things, but it really subjugates women. It's very strict religious rules. And a lot of Saudi money, which is a vague question, how do you separate Saudi wealth from the government, given it's a royal family with many, many scions? A lot of Saudi money has gone into Islamist groups and madrasas and all kinds of efforts to proselytize for their version of Islamic totalitarianism. So there's a real problem here with Saudi Arabia that you can't gloss over. And what we have seen is that the concern about the flow of Saudi oil distorts our thinking so that we don't give those kinds of moral considerations due attention. And I think that is a mistake, and it's led to a relationship where the United States still 20 years on and for many decades before viewed Saudi Arabia as an ally. And when you look at the facts, it's nothing like an ally. In fact, if you had 2 columns only, you would not put it in the ally column. You would put it in the hostile column. But of course, there are other gradations. I mean, I don't think that's the only way to view it. So I think that is and I think oil has been a distortive factor that misshapes whatever fills the vacuum of of our interest and our conception of it. And I think it's one symptom of not having a real conception of our interests. And just let me throw this back on the table. I was interested in your question, Greg, that you posed to Pete, which was, what are some principles that might be relevant for thinking about foreign policy? And I was curious to hear if Justin has a view or some thoughts to share on that, either in response to what Pete said or just of his own kind of perspective on this.
Justin?
Sure. So there's a lot on the table, and I wrote a paper last fall arguing for militarily withdrawing from the Middle East. So I have a lot to say about how oil has distorted American views of the Middle East. And let me, in a roundabout way, try to get my arms around everything and squeeze it together and see what sort of squirts out of my arms. So I agree with Elan that amorphous, underspecified views about oil have poisoned American policy in the Middle East. I think I'm not a nationalist, and I'm a relatively cosmopolitan person, but it really does chafe to see American presidents rattling their cup at the Saudis, begging for production decisions to go this way or that. An innovation of the Donald Trump presidency is that he was asking the Saudis to produce less, which is a rarity. Normally, we're asking them to produce more. But the Saudis are not as stupid as we would have them be. They make production decisions not in deference to American diplomatic goals, but in deference to their own pockets. And American politicians uniquely seem to act as though a certain amount of cajoling can produce variation in Saudi production decisions. And this is nonsense. And we have a lot of data to show that it's nonsense. And so to expand things a bit from the oil security pathologies that afflict uniquely American sort of strategic thinkers, State Department people, Defense Department people, energy economists don't think this. Not only do they not think that the Saudis will make production decisions based on American pleading, they don't think that volatility in energy markets, by and large, is based on political disruptions in the Middle East. This is a completely disregarded fringe view among energy economists. And And that's bad that American, guns and bombs and dead people, strategic thinkers dismiss energy economics and don't look at what energy economists attribute volatility in energy markets to. The general consensus among energy economists is that commodity prices tend to track together. And then if you look, for example, at the spikes in the 1970s, we were at a unique point in history where the Western business cycle, the East Asian business cycle were more or less synchronized. And this put severe strain on the production capacity of everyone who could produce, and that this was a sort of secular development, that it wasn't obviously a development of the OPEC or OPEC oil embargo, but because it happened after the oil embargo, we attributed it, the disruption and the gas lines, et cetera, to the oil embargo. So I think that's one pathology that afflicts American policy in the Middle East. The other two pathologies that afflict American policy in the Middle East, and the way that I framed this paper, which was sort of crude, but I didn't know how else to get at it, was that the United States really cares deeply about the Middle East for three main reasons: oil, Israel, and terrorism, right? We worry about these disruptions to energy markets, this idea that political instability or wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran could bring the American economy to its knees. And I've sort of tried to deal with that in as perfunctory a way as I could. We care about Israel. We don't want Israel to be overrun by terrorists or terrorist states or some combination of the two. And we worry about terrorism, especially after September the 11th. But I don't think that a robust on-the-ground presence, American presence in the Middle East has really redounded to Israel's benefit, right? I mean, I've had the occasion to look back at Benjamin Netanyahu's testimony to the US Congress in either late 2002 or early 2003, where he urged the Congress, I guarantee you, if you regime change Saddam Hussein, it will have great positive reverberations throughout the region. This is kind of a bad idea. In retrospect, that was not something that really, I think, Israel is happy about. I think the Israelis would probably like the United States to attack Iran now if it could get that development to happen. But our role in the Middle East has not been a good development to Israel. The main threat to Israel is the terror threat, partly from within itself and partly from the Palestinian Authority. And we could break this way or that way on that. But the U.S. role in the region is not helping that process forward to the benefit of Israel. And then with respect to terrorism, as I've suggested, I think that broadly the terrorist threat to the United States has been dramatically overstated by American analysts that enabled these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to drift on sort of perpetually. But with the benefit of hindsight, I mean, think about it. If you were putting your 401k in the prospect of a big terrorist attack in the United States today with a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year time horizon, do we really think that's likely? Do we really think that we should base policy on the likelihood of another 9/11 happening over 5, 10, 15, or 20 years? I think probably not. And I mentioned him previously, my colleague John Mueller wrote a very provocative article in the National Interest in the fall 2002 issue, with which I vehemently disagreed at the time, entitled Harbinger or Aberration, a 9/11 provocation. And John basically argued that it was an aberration, that it was what he called a tragic blip in the experience of U.S. national security. And I remember reading it back then and thinking, this guy is crazy. And then now, with the benefit of hindsight, I look back and think, if I had had skin in the game and if he had had skin in the game, he would be calling the tune today because he would have all of my money. So I think oil, Israel, and terrorism broadly are the three main reasons that the United States cares about the Middle East. And in the oil case, it's due to uniquely pathological views about energy markets. In the Israel case, it's due to a totally misconstrued conception of how Israel operates in the region. And with respect to the terrorism case, I just think that we have an overstated idea of the threat posed to the United States by Islamic fundamentalists. So I'll probably do best to leave it there.
Let me try to, thank you for that. Let me try to, and that brings us very much back to the big picture. So let me try to stay on the big picture and see if we can essentialize the difference between your 2 points of view. One thing that somebody might take away from having heard both of your remarks so far, I don't think this quite perfectly characterizes either of your views, but I think putting it this way might, and having you react to what's wrong with it, might bring that out. Someone might take your opening remarks to be saying, Elan is saying we didn't do enough, and Justin saying we did too much. And is that right? That is it we overestimated the threat and did too much on Justin's side, and we underestimated the threat, or we misidentified the threat and so didn't do enough on Elan's side? Or how would each of you revise or improve on that formulation of your positions?
If I can jump in, I would say we misunderstood the threat and we did the wrong things. I actually think we could have done less to accomplish our goals. I certainly don't think we needed the war in Iraq. I think Afghanistan was a defensible, and I think at the time I was in favor of it. I think there was good reason to go in and remove the Taliban and eliminate the Al-Qaeda forces. I think that's defensible. I don't think Iraq was. I think it was a mistake, the wrong war. So in the sense that I would say it's not a question of more sort of the quantity of what you do. It's a question of, do you have a clear conception of what you're trying to do? What is the enemy, or the threat, and what would be reasonable steps to take to eliminate that threat? And then let me make one other point of difference. I'm familiar with John Muller's views. I've actually responded to him in another article. I don't agree with his approach to this, but I do agree that there was an overstatement of the threat. That I think is true. I think if you listen to some of the statements from George W. Bush and for some of the people around him, and not only people who are Republicans at the time, there are people who are sort of seen as centrists who had the view that so long as Al-Qaeda has a perch in Afghanistan or on the border with Pakistan, this is an existential threat. I don't think that was realistic. What I think happens is that when you don't have a clear view of what you're facing, the fear comes in and you inflate what you think is a real problem. What I think is the difference is that I worry that the perspective that we're hearing from Justin is the kind of perspective we heard from people before 9/11. So, when the 1993 attempt to bring down the Twin Towers happened, only 40 people died, and I don't mean that to diminish the loss of life, but it was much smaller scale attack. It didn't succeed in bringing the towers down. And a prevailing view, and I think, I don't want to speak for John Muller, but I take his view to lead to this kind of perspective, is this whole idea of it being a blip. It's the kind of thing that we don't have to worry too much about, in effect. And that is, in effect, what the Clinton administration did in responding. They treated the 1993 attack as a criminal justice type issue and not really heeding the fact that, well, this is a manifestation of something bigger. There's a real movement behind this kind of thing, and it's not primarily understood as terrorism. It's an ideological phenomenon. And yes, I think we captured the ringleader behind 1993. He was in jail for a long time. I think he might still be there. I forget. And some of the people involved in it. And yet, you could have made the same point in 1994, saying, well, okay, this was an anomaly. Even if they had killed more than 40 people, okay, I get it, you're overstating the threat. But then what happens is this cascades, and the enemy, which I think is a point we haven't touched on, is there is something to be understood about how the enemy is encouraged or discouraged by the responses it sees America taking. And I think the response to the 1993 attack and other attacks subsequent to that, if you think about the coal incident in Yemen, if you think about the string of things that happened, it was not seen as a significant threat. And this is not to say this was a movement that could bring down the U.S. I don't think they were able to do that in 2001. I don't think they're able to do that now. So I don't think the options are it's existential or it's nothing. I think the question is.
Let me break in then here with a question from one of our viewers that relates to this. He asks, what's your evidence that we failed to keep the terrorist threat at a manageable level? That's a quote, so maybe you used that phrase, I don't remember earlier. He says, terrorism only kills 1 to 50 Americans per year. That's pretty minimal in a country that has 15,000 murders per year. No, question mark. So I take it what he's saying is, okay, you don't think it's an existential threat, but you want to say it is a threat, or there's some kind of cascade here to worry about. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but what's the evidence that it's something to worry about on any kind of significant scale as opposed to, say, ordinary crime? Given that, at least according to these statistics, terrorism kills an average of 1 to 50 people, whereas murder, many more are murdered. What's the response to the view that we're viewing this as we're over prioritizing fighting terrorism, fighting this movement, even if there is a movement that it might get involved in, maybe it's small potatoes relative to what our other priorities should be?
I think the issue is that this is, I think, a necessary part of what the government's role is, which is to protect us from foreign threats. And particularly when we have evidence to think this is something that can grow over time. So it might be that the statistics is right. These statistics are right, and I haven't looked at them lately. But wouldn't we want to address it so that they don't grow? And maybe this is the level at which we can. So this is what success looks like. I'm not saying that it can go to zero, because obviously crime can't go to zero and murder can't go to zero. But the point of the police force and the judicial system is to keep those numbers to the lowest they can be, and to go after the drivers behind those. And this is a case now where we have the benefit of 20 years worth of hindsight, and we have even more decades before 9/11 to see that the reaction of appeasement and passivity in the face of this threat causes it to get worse. So I think it's easy to overlook the other attacks that happened after 9/11. Not all of them here, and very few of them were here, which is significant, and I think it's a good thing. But I don't know if people on this call remember the attacks on the Madrid train system in 2004, or the London Underground in 2005, or just zoom forward to 2015 in Paris. Now, those people identified with ISIS. This was a really barbaric attack in the streets of Paris, suicide bombings at a stadium, drilling people with bullets at a concert. So yes, this is a mass casualty attack. Wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to deal with those sorts of things? And I think we can. Now, let me add one other element, because I think part of the premise of this kind of question is, surely we can live with this level of threat or this level of casualties. And in the background is, because the alternative is another disaster like Iraq or another disaster like Afghanistan. And I agree with you. If those are your options, certainly I wouldn't endorse going and taking further action, because I don't want us to have another Iraq, another Afghanistan kind of disaster. But I think it's a mistake to equate the past attempts to deal with this problem with what would be other opportunities and other things that could be more effective and less costly. And again, I think it's important to see that the Iraq and particularly Afghanistan experiences have colored our view of what's possible and what needs to be done. So I think there's a kind of distortion effect happening. And I'm not in favor of, again, it's important to get that I'm not in favor of reproducing those disasters, and I don't think they're necessary to succeed.
Okay, so I know you've written a lot elsewhere, and maybe we'll get for you to tell us later about some of the actions we should have taken. But I want to go to Justin now with, in effect, that same question, because one of our viewers is saying, I'll just read what he wrote to you. Your indictment of America's reactions after 9/11 are quite broad. What do you think the U.S. should have done to confront the threats revealed by this act of terrorism? So granted that we in your view, we overestimated it. What ought President Bush, or what ought America to have done on 9/12 and going forward?
So that's a really unsatisfying part of being me in this discussion, is that the things that I think were effective, hardening cockpit doors, making physically capable male passengers on airliners look askance at somebody being a knucklehead near a cockpit door, were actually quite cheap and not super satisfying politically. So I empathize with people who say, look, if we went into Afghanistan as you wanted us to do in late 2001, disrupted the Taliban, let's say Tora Bora broke the other way, broke in our favor, and we rounded up and killed more of these people. There's just not a lot left to do politically by 2002, 2003, right? There's a sort of maintenance capability to respond sort of obliquely to Elan. I don't really worry that the United States is going to that my admonitions are going to lead the United States to too low of a level of sensitivity. So John Mueller has this paper out recently where he points out accurately that public opinion in terms of the terrorist threat level is way higher than elite opinion still, after elites have begun to sort of come off terrorism, to begun to move to China as the great new threat, et cetera, et cetera. Public sentiment wants a robust, shouldery sort of response to terrorism. So I have very, very low concerns that we or the FBI or the CIA or the NSA are going to lower our guard too much. I think that the needle haystack problem is that we may be collecting too much hay and not focusing on where the needle may be because of this sort of generalized freak out about terrorism. So it looks like you have another question, so I'll just probably leave it there.
Okay, let me just, I know Elan needs to leave and I want to close at the half hour. So do you want to answer the same question? What should we have done? What should have been the central, what's the essence of what a policy response should have been? Part of it, I gather from your earlier remarks, is identifying the movement as this, identifying the enemy as this Islamist movement, but then what to do about it?
So I've written about this at length for in a number of books. The most recent one is called Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism, What Went Wrong After 9/11. I encourage people to explore it if they're interested in the more detailed perspective. And the previous book is called Winning the Unwinnable War. The more recent one is available for free in PDF, and people can find that if they Google for it with my name. I think the essence of the answer is to take seriously that this is a movement driven by ideas and that has state leadership and that there's state sponsorship, and that dealing with these inspirations and financial backers is a necessary condition of demoralizing this movement. So if you study the history of the Islamist movement, one of the things that put it a real accelerant was the success of the Iranian regime in two episodes. The first was post the revolution in the Iranian hostage crisis, taking American diplomats at the US embassy and holding them captive and humiliating them. And the US capitulated in that confrontation instead of going after and trying to rescue the diplomats. And this taught the Iranians a lesson, and not only the Iranians, but others who were sympathetic to the fact that here was a regime that was trying to implement this vision of an Islamist totalitarian approach, and they succeeded in humbling and humiliating America. And I think that was a galvanizing moment for other Islamists, whether they're Shiite or Sunni, it didn't really matter fundamentally. I think the second, there are a number of episodes that were further galvanizing that happened in America's weak and appeasing response. Understanding that trajectory and how it galvanizes the movement to the point where they go from taking hostages to taking.
Could I just break in with the question? So what you're summarizing how things went bad and how the movement was emboldened and progressed.
Yeah.
But what I just like a kind of headline or the kind of simple version of the answer from is, okay, so we needed to do something about that. We needed to attack the state sponsors and the funders, but not in something that looked like the Afghanistan or Iraq wars. So what's the top line of what would attacking those sources have looked like?
Okay, so my reason in mentioning those is to emphasize the part of this which is not understood, which is the galvanizing and demoralizing valences that you can get with certain responses. The top line is, I think you would have to focus on the regimes that see themselves as the leaders of this movement. So, and I think the primary ones are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I don't think it means you launch a war to nation build in Iran or Saudi Arabia. I don't think it even needs to be a war. I think there is enough here to coerce them into capitulating by a show of real moral confidence that they're wrong, denouncing them and denouncing all those who follow them. And then in addition, obviously regimes like the Taliban had to be eliminated, and anyone who harbors ISIS or enables ISIS and other groups like them. I think that's the essential. It's going after these enablers and sponsors and inspiration points. And that's as much as the headline as I'm willing to offer.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Justin and earlier to Peter for sharing your thoughts today. A sad anniversary coming up tomorrow. And we hope people will also join some of the Salem Center personnel next, I think it's Tuesday, when we're going to be also looking back on 9/11, this time with an eye to how it's impacted American policy generally, not just foreign policy, but how we think about ourselves as a nation and what its footprint has been in our past. I want to thank both of our panelists again, and wish you all a good weekend and a reflective anniversary.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
Bye-bye.